probably worthwhile giving a historical context to our current economic problems. Take us back to the GFC and what happened back then when all of these massive companies started to fail in the United States and the credit default swap things snowballed. Your observation was they simply got all of that debt, took it from the private companies and said to the government, here, it's yours.
That's right. 2 points. One is that something that the Romans knew 2,000 years ago, we've forgotten. There's a big difference. It's a difference between chalk and cheese, between a deposit and a loan. The trouble is that our banks lend deposits and that every once in a while it gets themselves into great, great difficulty. That's to say the money which you rock up in order to empty your check account isn't there, quite literally. So that when banks get themselves into trouble, historically over hundreds upon hundreds of years, close to 500 years, their friends, the government steps in. Why does the government step in? Because banks and governments have a very tight relationship. Banks lend to government to do things like war, welfare, warfare, and so on. And that when banks get into trouble, their friends, the government step in, and it's the taxpayers who carry the can. Carrying things forward into 2007, 2008, 2009, a slightly modern twist to this awful story is that, yes, once again, banks got themselves into a world of difficulty. And as you said, governments rolled a fair few of these debts under their own, that's to say, government's balance sheets, so that bankrupt private sector entities are today bankrupt government sector entities. The same problems remain. We have basically a Harvard or a Yale standard rather than a gold standard, whereby a very small group of people who think that they're more intelligent than the rest of us say with a straight face the problem, which is being caused by too much debt, is to borrow more.
Which they did. We now know it as the, I forget what the phrase, the fiscal stimulus. It had a wonderful term that eludes me, Chris Leith. Can you recall what it was?
My mind is blank. On occasion it is now. It'll perhaps
it'll come back to me, but yep. I forget what it was T1, T2 and T3. I forget what it was, what the US government called their fiscal stimulus.
Oh, quantitative easing, QE.
Quantitative easing. Yep. Quantitative easing is the economist term, but most people would call it just more debt.
More debt and basically taking private sector property and confiscating it. When one says that the government is printing money, well, a central bank is writing a check to a treasury. What does a treasury do with that check? It goes out and buys things. It basically will now buy goods and services which private sector individuals can no longer do. So it's confiscation by another name.
All right, so here we are, a couple of years down the track. Your argument is that this is not a new problem, Chris Leith. No, this is the old one, just snowballing from where it started.
It was a bad, stinky cheese several years ago, and it's rotted a bit more since then. That's precisely right. We've been dragged kicking and screaming, a few people, not very many, into the realization, goodness me, one cannot indefinitely live beyond one's means. Governments are no different from that. They don't. They pretend they do, but they're not subject to different rules from you and I. But they go on and they pretend as if they can spend beyond their means indefinitely. And what we're seeing is that simply isn't true.
All right, now take me on the weekend, the G20, in response to Christine Lagarde's warning that unless governments coordinated a prompt action, this would be an economic disaster. And the G20 came out and pledged a strong and coordinated response. Yet you've observed that they pledged something similar back in, 15th of March 2009. Just run through the key points, if you would, of when they promised their response when.
The first inklings would have been back in 2008, but more specifically back roughly in the first quarter of 2009 to say, goodness me, some financial institutions have got themselves into strife. Buzzwords such as coordinated response, buzzwords such as basically, we have to bail them out because if we don't bail them out, all sorts of unspeakably awful things will occur. The pretext being awful things might occur. Basically, people realize that our leaders have soft heads and feet of clay, that the things which have been said to taxpayers for a generation simply aren't true. That in actual fact one cannot spend beyond one's means indefinitely, whether you're an individual, a household, a business, or a government. So to not coin a phrase, but perhaps take one out of context, all we should be saying is to give collapse a chance. collapse is to say, look, we recognize now we've gone cold turkey. We simply cannot spend beyond our means. We have to start from scratch and realize that our means, in actual fact, are far more limited than our politicians have led us to believe for a generation. The trouble is that these coordinated fiscal responses, issuing of funny money, now the Europeans are considering issuing a Europe-wide bond to paper over those problems on a continental-wide basis.
More debt.
That's right. Right. It's got, to use another phrase, they're kicking a can down the path. The can is getting bigger and bigger. It's turned into a 42-gallon drum. Who knows, over the elapse of time, it's going to become so big that it ceases to be simply something that's leaking, but something now that's gushing out in torrents, and it becomes a problem that, had it been properly addressed years before, there would have been pain, but because it hasn't been addressed for the simple reason that politicians have refused to tell the truth, people are going to suffer even more.
All right, let me sort of go to Christine Lagarde's comments. Her point is that if governments don't deal with this, it's going to be far worse than it was a couple of years ago. Let me ask you about Argentina. 10 years ago, Argentina defaulted on its payments, and it was the big economic story of the time. And it went into significant economic decline, currency-wise, unemployment-wise, and more. However, as I understand it, Argentina, in some ways, has emerged as a strong, self-sufficient economy. Is that unreasonable? Is there an argument that, you know, letting something collapse or default, like Greece, is the sort of, you know, no gain without pain thing that may be needed?
Subject to a couple or three critical caveats, critical ifs. If there's something approximating a rule of law, clear and simple systems whereby, that's yours and this is mine, and we can exchange titles to property. That's point one, or the critical first if. A second if is that if the diagnosis is an accurate one, saying what led the country, in this case Argentina, into those sorts of difficulties is massive overspending over years and years and decades, and that simply has to stop. Subject to those absolutely critical caveats, then yes, once things collapse into a heap, if people take their medicine and if they learn their lesson, then a more prosperous future is a distinct possibility. For Europeans, I see absolutely no evidence of that. That the whole the so-called European experiment, the notion that Greeks and Germans and Spaniards and Finns and you name it somehow can subsume, that somehow human beings are going to pretend that they're not human beings, that they're not nationalists, that ultimately a Finn is no different from a Spaniard, is no different from a Greek. It puts a smile on their face because it's patently absurd. If people properly recognize the differences and say, we, the Finns, inhabit a very cold part of Europe. We have forests and whatnot. You, the Spaniards, inhabit a much warmer part of Europe. You have origins. We can trade.
So their economic interests are entirely different.
They are congruent in the sense that they're good at different sorts of things, and they can gain from trade. But to pretend somehow that Europe is this homogenous entity and it has to be standardized from the Baltic to the Mediterranean, that's going to lead to all manner of difficulties, and indeed it has led to all manner of difficulties. My
guest is Chris Leithner from Leithner and Associates. This is ABC Local Radio Queensland, ABC Local Radio New South Wales. My name's Steve Austin. The Industry Super Network today put out a release pointing out that research on members of Australian retail super funds would have earned better money if they just had their money in the bank rather than relying on shares. So let me come to the Australian scene. Australia is not in the same problem that does not have the same problem the rest of the world has. Compared to the rest of the world, we are in a much better scenario, yet we've seen gold stocks today plunge in Australia. I think nearly 10%, if I read that correctly. Why is it having such a knock-on effect here?
Well, I'm not entirely sure that Australia is in a diametrically better position than the rest of the world.
Well, we've got productive capacity. We don't have the same debt loading as countries overseas.
Oh, goodness me. Take Australians' debt loads as individuals. We are just as heavily indebted as Americans and Europeans are. Yes,
what personal household debt?
Take the sum total of local plus state plus Commonwealth debt, and certainly at the Commonwealth level compared to other countries with the Commonwealth relentlessly crows. It's true the Commonwealth's debt is not nearly as great as a percentage of GDP as other countries' debt is, but take government debt plus corporate debt and that critical household debt, Australia's potentially in as much a pickle as other countries are. that ultimately when people become nervous overseas, they become nervous. They're not going to distinguish between government sector and private sector debt. They're going to say, oi, there's a country, Australia, that owes a ton of money externally. Does it have the capacity to repay in a hurry if demanded to do so? Well, no debtor who's in debt to that extent can repay it very, very rapidly. So my first point would be simply to query that relentless, propaganda coming out of Canberra and the Reserve Bank that somehow the so-called fundamentals of this country are demonstrably better than elsewhere. When all's said and done, Australians as households are as heavily indebted, say, as Brits, as Americans, as Canadians, and as a fair few Europeans.
They're indebted with things like home loans, and homes have value. In other words, they can sell them and convert that into cash, can't they?
They can sell them.
So it's asset-backed debt.
Well, they can sell them if there's a fellow who's willing to buy that house for a price that's considerably greater than the mortgage. What many Americans have found is that, in actual fact, they can't do that. What banks have found is that if they can't extend or roll over the debts, then that causes a fair bit of difficulty in the mortgage system. So the answer to your question is, well, gee, yes, Australians own houses. What's one willing to pay for a house? Exactly that amount that you're willing to pay for. But when the balloon goes up, when suddenly financial difficulties are on the front pages of the newspaper, it's not a given. It's not a 100% certainty that one can sell the house very quickly for the price that one needs to clear the mortgage.
Reading the front page of the Australian Financial Review today, you get the impression that there's a lot of hope in the announcement by the G20 group of nations that they're putting together a package to rescue the world from. I forget what the term was they use now, but an economic car crash.
They have to rely on hope because they don't have reason. They have to babble on about confidence because they don't have capital. That person who has capital and savings, by definition, is going to be reasonably confident about the future. That person who has no capital, that's to say in debt up to his eyeballs, basically has to hope for the best because he has no capital upon which to draw.
People have been throwing their cash into gold. In other words, it's seen as a safe haven, yet for some reason the gold price dropped, 9.7% today, I think.
Gold will rise, gold will fall. Indeed, any asset will rise and fall. Compare the price of gold today to that of about 10 years or so, when, by the way, Gordon Brown, who at the time was the Chancellor of the Exchequer, said all manner of dismissive things about gold, sold a fair bit of the Bank of England's reserves of gold at a price of something like $300 per ounce. It's dramatically higher than, notwithstanding any overnight fall or a fall of the percentage point that you mentioned just a minute ago. Why is the price of gold, has it been rising over the past 10 years? Because the purchasing power of paper money has been falling relentlessly over the past 10 years. Come what may, gold has this incredible attribute, which is why governments dislike it. Governments cannot print gold. And whether one is a Muslim, whether one is Jewish, whether one is a Christian or an agnostic or an atheist, they will disagree radically about all manner of things. Who is God, what is mankind, the relationship between the two. But they agree on one thing, that gold is marketable. They will swap gold for oil, they will swap gold for wheat, they will swap gold for whatever else it might be. Gold is an instrument of peace in the way that paper money is not, because that other person's going to be suspicious. You, the Americans, and your greenback emission, never mind greenhouse emissions, the greenback emissions around the world are causing all manner of dissent. The money which you hold today is relentlessly falling in purchasing power over time, which is why people, it seems to me, over the past decade or so, have crowded into gold.
Final question. Does it matter very much whether Australia's federal government manages to get the books to be in surplus next financial year? Does it matter? Much of the debate in Canberra seems to be whether or not the federal government will have a surplus next year. Does that really matter that much to the overall economic health of Australia?
Ultimately, yes, it does emphatically. Again, the point is very simple, which is perhaps why politicians don't want to talk about it, that all of us have to live within our means. That includes governments. If governments cannot live within their means, then they have to cut expenditure. That's something that no American politician, no British, no European politician is willing to countenance. The trouble, though, is that the laws of economics are reimposing themselves upon us, that whether we like it or not, and most of us don't like it, we've lived too high on the hog, we've overestimated our living standards, and that all of us, I dare say, are going to have to tighten the belt a notch or two, and that definitely includes governments.
Chris Leatham, thanks for coming in.
Great pleasure.